If we have a look at our application here, the code is generally well written, but we have improvement potential. Regarding the performance, only a little bit with more const calls and so on. What we can't avoid here is that we basically always call build method in the main Dart file because we do use the media query in there, and well, it impacts almost everything here, and therefore there's little optimization potential. Though there is some, to be honest. For example, the app bar and the Cupertino navigation bar doesn't really use the media query. So what you could do is you could take all the content that does use the media query and put that into a separate widget, which then only rebuilds when the media query changes, and media query changes wouldn't trigger a rebuild overall here, and hence also rebuild our navigation bars, even though these are not interested in the media query. But that's such a tiny impact here that you could also ignore it, but it would be one potential refactoring. Nonetheless, one thing you can do in this app, however, is, for example, in the transaction list. There we have our list item, this card here with all its content. And it would make sense to take this large chunk of this widget tree and put it into a separate widget. Not really for performance reasons, but to make this code more readable, because it's a relatively large widget. You could certainly leave it that way, but still, it's relatively large, and since this makes such a nice individual widget, I mean, a list item, isn't that a perfect separate widget? It would make sense to put this into a separate widget, so that when you come back to your code, or a fellow developer looks at your code and wants to edit the list item, the developer doesn't have to go through the entire transaction lists widget, but can quickly go to the transaction item file here and start editing in there, and can ignore the transaction list. Now, creating a new widget, thankfully, is really simple. You can simply mark the content which should go into the new widget. So in this case, it's this card here, all the way up to the end of this card. And then use the refactoring tool with that shortcut, and then choose Extract Widget. You're then asked for a name here, and I'll name this transaction item following that Pascal case notation with a capital character at the beginning and for every word inside of the word, and then hit enter. And now in the same file, it will give you a new widget with your name, and then the build method will contain the part you outsourced. Now in this case here, we still have to do some manual fixes to make sure that we get the right transaction data into this widget, but it's definitely easier than building this from scratch. Now I will actually cut this widget and add it into a new file, transaction_item.dart, and simply copy my code in here. Now in here we then need to import a couple of things. We first of all need the material Dart file. We also use the transaction model, so we will have to import that. And for this I'll go to the models folder and then import transaction Dart. And I also want to change the code that was generated here. I don't want to get my list of transactions here. Instead, I want to get a single transaction here, because this is created for a single transaction. So I'll rename this to transaction, and the type here will then also just be transaction, not a list of transactions. And in the constructor, I of course say this transaction. This is where I want to store this at. By the way, this also created named arguments, and it added two things, the key and this part after the constructor, which we haven't learned about. For now, let's ignore it. I'll come back to this key thing here later. Other than that, it's a normal constructor with named arguments. Down in the code here, we can now simply refer to transaction, which is this new property I just created, .amount, and so on. So everywhere where we used transaction index, we now use just transaction. I'm also using the date format class here, and that means we also have to import the intel package, and there the intel Dart file. This unlocks the date format class. In the transaction list Dart file, we can therefore get rid of that intel import because we're not using it here anymore. And there, where this transaction item gets created, in case Flutter or this plugin still did it for you, you can remove the new keyword. It's not required. And the data we're forwarding, of course, is not transactions, but transaction, and the value for that is transactions index, because we're still in the list view builder, and hence we go through all the transactions, with the help of their length. And here, for every item that is built, we forward the transaction at that index we're building the item for. Last but not least, since we outsourced transaction item into a new file, you need to import that file here at the top by pointing at transaction item.dart. And with that, we have the exact same application as before. We'll also not have any performance gains, but this code is more readable. We have a shorter transaction list widget, and shorter generally always is better, because if you have less content in a file, it's easier to grasp what's happening in the file. And if you just want to edit the transaction item, you can simply go to the transaction item Dart file and have all the relevant content there. With that, our application still, of course, should work as before. If I add a new value here for today, let's say, that still appears here, and deleting it also still works. So that still works, but this is now one possible improvement that makes sense.